and keep my eyes above the waves. My soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours, and you are mine. Oh,
Good morning, I'm Sandy Dornbos, and I am the mother of 3 children. I have Joshua, who is now 38. I have Tina, who is 36. A granddaughter, Izzy, who is 15, and my youngest daughter is Elsa, and she is going to be 28. I'm going to tell you today a story of how God turned our tragedy in our lives into triumph. I'll begin with back when a little history on my children. Josh was born in 1983, and when he was 2 years old, we discovered that he had some special needs, and so he began special needs schooling. He had some cognitive disabilities and was diagnosed with a seizure disorder. Tina, when she was about 5, she also was diagnosed with some difficulties in her learning, cognitive areas, and then later was diagnosed with some major depression and some other mental disabilities. In 1983, my daughter Elsa was born. No problems that we knew of at that time. When she was about 3.5 months, I was working full time at the time, and I came home from work and realized that my husband's car was gone and the kids were gone, and that was very unusual when I would come home from work. So I went in the house and the phone was ringing pretty constantly. So I answered the phone, and it was a call from the doctor's office saying that I needed to get to the doctor's office as soon as possible for the kids' doctor's office. And I needed to be there as soon as I could get there. So I rushed to the doctor's office right away, and they took me into a room where they had Elsa on a table, and she was laying there just kind of moaning. No particular sound, just kind of a plain moan. And you could put your hand in front of her eyes and she would not move. Her eyes wouldn't blink, she wouldn't move. You could touch her, nothing would happen. As she laid there on the table, just kind of wondering what in the world is going on, what happened. Doctors explained that they didn't quite know what was going on. They wanted us to take her to the emergency room right away. So we packed the kids back in the car, and Grandma and Grandpa got the children. They met us to get the kids at the hospital, and took Tina and Josh, went into the room with the doctors, and they asked a few questions. Questions weren't real clear, answered real clear, weren't real sure what was going on. Eventually, they put my husband and I in a room and told us that, they were going to be doing some checking of her and checking her over, seeing what was going on, and they would come back later and get us. In the meantime, we sat in this room, and I just kind of wasn't sure what was going on. There was a counselor, I believe it was, that came in and took my husband out of the room and asked him some questions. They came back in the room, brought him back in the room and with me, and explained that he had admitted that he shook Elsa. This was, of course, distressful. Didn't quite know what was happening. They had us stay in this room, and during that time, once I heard what had happened, instead of anger, I felt anger, but it was like a peace came over me that it was unexplainable. Just felt like it's going to be okay. Things are going to be okay. Really didn't know what was going to happen. Ended up with sitting in this room with my husband after this had been told to me, and just feeling that I knew Elsa was going to be okay, and I knew the whole situation would work out somehow. I think that comes from, I had a mother who was a wonderful Christian lady, and she would always say when things went wrong, It's okay. It's going to work out. At this time, we kind of sat together and talked. I was able to talk instead of being angry. I was able to talk with him and try to figure out what happened, what went wrong. He had some anger issues and was working third shift and was very tired, and she was crying, and he could not control himself, basically, and shook her. A little bit later, the doctors came in and they let me go back in with Elsa. And I don't know a whole lot, I can't remember a whole lot of what happened with him after that. As far as I know, that he did have to leave the hospital, but I don't know, I can't remember what happened with that. But I know that I was in the room with Elsa, and doctors had taken her in for some testing, some MRIs and CAT scans and all those kinds of things going on. She had two hematomas in her brain, hematomas in her brain, and they were bleeding pretty bad. So they immediately went in and installed two exterior shunts in the brain. Those were like little tubes that came out of her head, and then they were attached to a ball that drained the blood from the brain. Those needed to be emptied about every hour. They would come in and drain those. At that point, that process kind of went on, and they worked with her quite a bit, and then brought me up to a room where she would be, and I stayed with her. And that evening, doctors came in and told me that, the brain injury was pretty severe, and they didn't know if she would live. And if she did live, she probably would be a vegetable and never walk or talk again. At that point in time, I felt myself saying, I know that my God is bigger than yours. And I know that my God has a plan for this child. And I felt that peace again come over me, that I knew that God had a plan, and somehow it was going to be okay. It was the most difficult words I ever heard, but I knew that there was something, and God had some kind of a plan for her. So I began to pray for her and to pray for the whole situation, not knowing where it was going. There were several days when she did not show any progress. There was a period of probably about a week or week and a half when I couldn't even hold her. All I could do is sit by her bed and rub her arm. Could not touch her head at all. The doctor explained that the doctor told me to imagine the worst headache you could ever have and multiply that by 10. And that's what her head felt like. So you had to be very careful when you touched her in any way. And of course, that didn't help when the nurses and doctors would come in and they're drawing blood and they're moving her around and they're doing this and that. And it's like, I can't touch her, but you're making a mess of her. That was very difficult. But the second day that she was in the hospital, I had a wonderful pastor and his wife who came in, and they decided that they were going to stay that evening with Elsa and pray for her, and they forced me to go home. I didn't want to, but they forced me to go home. I could get some rest and possibly see the other two kids for a while. So I did go on home that night, was able to visit with the kids, and that was good, but got a little bit of rest. When I returned to the hospital the next day, I was told that in the middle of the night, she had a very long seizure that most people would never survive from. My pastor and his wife had been praying for her all night long, and I feel that that's the reason she made it through that seizure. I'm sure that's why. And so, again, it was a negative thought and a negative thing that had happened. And one more time where they were saying, we're not sure that she's going to make it. So as time went on, it was about a week later, and she started to show some progress. She had had a blood transfusion during that time because she had lost so much blood. She started to show some progress, and then all of a sudden there was some things that took place where it kind of went backwards again. Well, come to find out, one of the shunts was blocked, and so they had to go in and do another surgery to remove that shunt and put it in a different place. So made it through that surgery okay, and then once that happened, then we started to see some more progress. The worst part we had at this point was when they would draw blood, there was no place to draw blood from anymore because the veins had kind of collapsed and they couldn't draw any blood. So they started to draw blood out of her forehead, from the vein in her forehead. It was horrible to watch, to see. But through all of that, God provided and He was there. And a few days later, we started to see a little progress again, and things just continued to get better. After about 3 or 4 weeks of being in the intensive care unit, they moved her to the regular pediatric ward, and that was a blessing. There still wasn't a lot of progress, but enough where they felt it was safe to move her down to that level. She spent about 3 weeks there, and of course during this time the therapist had come in and neurologist had come in, and just all kinds of different things had happened. Also during this time there was the court that had come in the process of charging him and whether to charge him or not to charge him at that time. I wasn't a big part of that because I was at the hospital all of the time, other than being interviewed again by a police officer and, asked several questions at that time. But my job, I felt, was to be at the hospital. And fortunately, I was able to do that and be there during this time. After she was moved to the regular care area, to the pediatric ward, progress again happened where she continued to progress. Doctors were amazed that she was doing as well as she was. After about 2 more weeks, they moved her to Mary Free Bed. That was a huge move. It was very positive and great that happened. The first night she was there, the eye specialist came in because they thought there might be some damage to her eyes. Wonderful man came in, and of course the move was very emotional, very hard to move her from one place to the other and get her situated, and with all the other worries of my other 2 kids, and what was going on, what was happening. At that time, he came in and he examined her, and I was in tears, and he just said, "It's going to be okay. We can work with this. It's going to be okay." She had some nerve damage in her eyes also, and at that point, he wasn't real sure how bad that was. That would have to wait till a little later to find out how that was. But felt very comfortable with him as her ophthalmologist, and he was very good. Things went along. Of course, every day was therapy with her, and they came in and did that several times a day. And every day we would take a walk in the wagon down the hallway, and we found a lady down the hallway in the adult ward whose name was also Elsa. And she was an elderly lady, but we would go in every day and visit her. My Elsa would be laying in the wagon, and I would just, we'd go in and visit with this lady for a little while, and that was just a blessing. She was a really sweet lady, and she was praying for us. Once we got to know her, she said she would pray for us, and so we enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed it more, I'm sure, than Elsa, because she probably didn't really realize it, but that was a blessing while we were there. There were times when, of course, it was very difficult because you would still get the negative reports of, we're not real sure how far she's going to come. There still was no muscle tone as far as being able to do anything like sitting up or, on her own. They would have to prop her all the time. She spent, I think, 3 weeks in Mary Free Bed and then was released to come home. When we got home, then it was wonderful to be back home, of course, but she had to have therapy every day. The court process had also taken place at this time, and I was told by the courts that I had to quit my job. I had a job, full-time job at a therapy center where Elsa could have gone along with me every day and had therapy. But they were not okay with that because I had the other two kids at home also. So I was told I had to quit my job. I had to get the children on disability and I had to go on government assistance. So that took place. And at that time, again, there was anger because I was very upset about that and didn't think that was right. But when I look back, I know that that was the best option and that was the best thing because I was able to be there for the kids when they needed me to be there, and for Elsa every day having therapy. She had therapy at home 2 or 3 times a week, and then we also went to Mary Free Bed every day. And that went on for 2 or 3 years. When she was 2, then she started in Ken O'Shea schools in their infant toddler program. She got therapy there. I think it was 3 days a week. And then we also still continued to go to Mary Free Bed pretty much every day at that time. As time went on, more progress took place and she just continued to grow, those muscles continued to strengthen. She just kept progressing. And of course, I believe that was all due to prayer and just my prayers, but prayers of other people as well. So along with that, I had been attending a great church and the ladies had started a Bible study. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go. Found someone that would sit with Elsa and the kids while I was at Bible study. And so I started going to Bible study, and that Bible study was on journaling your prayers, but it was also partially on forgiveness. And so I started to realize that some of the forgiveness had to take place. It was really hard. There was a lot of anger that I had built up. There was anger towards my husband. There was anger towards people who felt that this was partially my fault. People who didn't approve of, at this point, my relationship with my husband and his family was still pretty good. I was able to make sure that the kids could still see their father and see their grandparents. And, I did my best to try to be polite and kind and do what I could to make that relationship work. But there was still a lot of anger there. There was anger because people didn't think that that was right. They wanted me just to have him prosecuted and he should go away to jail forever. And those kinds of things took place. And there was a lot of anger there. There was also a lot of anger towards him because of the responsibilities that I now had, being thrown into being a single parent. I pretty much had to deal with the kids. I had the courts put the kids on as wards of the court in my custody. So every week they came into the home and I had to, they had to be checked over for any bruises and they had to answer questions and I had to answer questions, and that had to happen every week. That was for about 2 or 3 years that went on. And so besides all the responsibility of trying to take Elsa to, provide for her and what she needed, with the other two having special needs, there was all the school things that took place. And, I became very busy with what I had to do and had no time for myself. So later, as this Bible study progressed, I began to start to think, well, I need to forgive him for what he did to the kids. So I did that. I wrote down pretty much everything that was bugging me and everything that I was angry about. And I asked God to help me forgive him for that. And after that, I felt much better and things started to go better. But it wasn't until a few years later when I realized that God showed me that I hadn't asked him to forgive my husband for what he did to me also. In those issues, there was a lot of other issues in our marriage that wasn't good. And I kind of got to a point where I just gave up and said, I need time for me, and gave up on our marriage basically. And that kind of carried through as my kids got older. It carried through to the point where, I'd be so busy during the day with all the things that they had to do and had going on. And I would just kind of say, when the day came to the point where we were home at night, I would just kind of say, okay, it's my time and you go do what you want. I don't care. You just go play, go whatever. And a lot of responsibility fell on Josh and Tina as older brother and sister too. So as time went on, Elsa continued to progress, which was good. He started in regular school, still in special education programs, but went on, and more forgiveness took place as time went on. The Lord kind of just showed me that, I needed to forgive, but I also needed to ask for forgiveness for things that weren't right along the way, things that weren't right in our marriage, things that weren't right in my own life. I had to forgive myself for things that I did that I shouldn't have done. Ask for forgiveness for from my kids. So as time went on, Elsa continued again to progress. She still went to therapy, but it was a few times less each week. It was, I think, 3 times a week. That continued until she was about 13. And then we were able to stop doing the therapy. As time went on, she continued in some special education classes. As she got to about 6th grade, right in there, 5th, 6th grade, there was a lot of bullying that took place in the neighborhood. She wasn't doing real well in school. It was difficult for her. A lot of the things that she was dealing with from the past, I think, she was at that kind of preteen, teenage age. It became real difficult for her. And she started to get into feeling depressed, had some depression going on. Neighborhood kids began to bully her and tell her that, she wasn't worth anything. She might as well just kill herself. So she decided that that's what she had to do. So she decided she was going to go out in the backyard and try to hang herself a day. Fortunately, she wasn't successful. We caught her before anything happened. But again, because of those feelings, she had visits from our pastor. We had changed churches because the other one had closed, but we still were involved with a good church. She had several visits with people from church and the pastor, and there was a gentleman that worked there that went to our church, and he would just every once in a while slip a card underneath her door from him and his wife, and that helped a lot. But through all this process, I had a brother that lived in Petoskey, and him and his wife and their daughter had been praying for Elsa. They'd been praying for Elsa, and that God would touch her and help her get through this. A couple weeks after she'd been home, my brother called and said that through the process of praying for Elsa, they felt that the Lord led them to see if I would be willing to let Elsa come and live with them. Their daughter Julie, she was a teacher in a small Christian school there. And she had talked to the school, and the school had said that, she could come, and that they had grants to help pay for her tuition, and that I could just pay what I could pay, and we wouldn't have to worry about the financial end. So we talked about this a little bit more, and it was very hard to make the decision, but I decided that that's what we should do after praying and feeling like that's what God wanted us to do. So she didn't like the idea very well. It made her feel like I was wanting to just get rid of her, which of course wasn't the case, but she didn't realize that. So we made the plans to take her up to Petoskey. She moved in with my brother and sister-in-law. My niece Julie got her acquainted at school and introduced her to the teachers. And when she started school there, she would have been going into she was would have been going into the ninth grade. She was probably halfway through eighth grade. And her reading levels and her academic levels were basically at a fourth or fifth grade level. So they started her out in seventh grade instead of eighth grade. Teachers were wonderful. They worked with her. Within about a year and a half, she had gone from the fourth grade level to the seventh, eighth grade level where she should be, and very close to where she should be, and even higher. And just us, I started to see her spiritual life develop as well. She, again, as a teenager, she was a little obstinate and didn't want to do things like memorizing verses that was required and things like that. Started to become interested in some trips that the school did with missions. They were local things usually that they would do on spring break or whatever. Kind of to go backwards a little bit, when Elsa was she was in elementary school, and our church always did a kids service. But once a month, they had a lady who would come in and she would do a missionary story. Well, Elsa read, or the lady did a story on a missionary in Haiti. When they were done with the missionary person, they could take a missionary book and read this missionary book if they wanted to. So she came home with this missionary book about this person that went to Haiti. It was just awesome what God did with that. That book stuck in her head forever. And so back to school, that when she did these little mission trips, that kind of started a thought of missions in her head. And my brother that she lived with was a missionary, local missionary. And so she kind of got a taste of that missionary life and what it was like while she was there. She was able to graduate from high school with honors, decided that she was going to go on to college. I thought, man, are you going to be able to do this? But, God instilled in her this feeling of, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. As that time went on, she went to college in Petoskey at a community college. She received her associate's degree in early childhood education. During that time also, she was able to go on a trip to Uganda, a missionary trip to Uganda. Went with the church group there, and that was just awesome. She just enjoyed that so much and kind of gave her another taste of that overseas missionary work. A year or so later, she learned that there was going to be a trip to Haiti. Of course, with reading the story on Haiti, the missionary there, that just immediately when she heard that, she decided, I have to go. I have to go. Through these trips and everything, God provided all the finances, everything that was needed, He provided. It was just amazing, His provision for her. So she was able to go to Haiti and just absolutely loved it there, had a wonderful time, had a great time. So when she came back, she really felt that God was calling her somehow to missions, but she didn't know where. She wanted to go to Africa somewheres, but didn't know where. So she started to look into some things that were possibilities. She worked with a program where she originally was going to go to Africa. 2 months before she was ready to go, there was a ban put on anyone coming into the country, the area where she was going to go. So that was kind of very disheartening to her because it wasn't going to happen. She couldn't go there. There were possibilities of going other places, but at that time they couldn't tell her where. So we started to pray about that a little bit more, about, okay, where do we go from here? Her grandparents, her dad's mom and dad, they started to pray about that also, and they had some friends, and she had an aunt and uncle who had served in the Christian school in Rehoboth, New Mexico. So they started to talk to her about that a little bit, and she'd heard stories of Rehoboth before from family members. Her aunt and uncle connected her with a family that was here for the summer, but in the fall they would always spend the winter in Rehoboth helping at the school there. So we started talking about that. We started praying about that, met with these people, and within about probably a couple months, it didn't take long, and she decided that that's where she wanted to go as a volunteer. She wanted to go volunteer to help at the school there. It was in an area where there were many Navajo children that would come to the school. So we started to make plans for that. Well, there was a lot of things that had to take place in a couple months. Where are you going to live? Well, the school provided her a room in what they called the mission house, which is an old part of the school that they used for volunteers that would come down throughout the year to work. And they gave her a room there, which most of the time she was there, she had the whole building to herself. And that was really, really nice. And so that was provided. She wanted to take her car down. How am I going to get my car there? I can't drive that far. And how am I going to get my car there? Well, it just so happened that this family that was from here, from Hudsonville area, they had another person that was in Rehoboth that worked in Rehoboth that was coming here for a wedding in Hudsonville at the same time. And so instead of him flying back, he said, I'll drive her car back for her. So she packed her car up with all her things, and he picked up her car and drove it to Rehoboth. And a few days later, she flew off to Rehoboth. God has just provided amazingly. From being told that she would probably never live, and if she did, she'd be a vegetable, not walk or talk. It's amazing what God has done and the miracles He's performed in her life. She now is going to school for her bachelor's degree in early childhood education. Will be finishing that, I believe, next year. She'll be finishing up with that. And just truly enjoying being there. She is now a lead teacher in the school classroom, preschool room, and just loving being there. She's had so many people that have just surrounded her and brought her into life there and the church there, and is just doing wonderful. Wonderful. So God has surely blessed us and taken care of us. And